Good morning. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here today. I have to tell you, I don't know you don't know this, but when I was 10 years old, I lived in Mexico, and so when I come to Mexico, I always feel like I'm coming home. I don't know if you've ever heard about data warehouse, but corporations today use data warehouse around the world. And they use them in Mexico, they use them in the United States, they use them Australia, Japan. It's a worldwide phenomenon. And I thought that it might be interesting for you today to hear where data warehouse came from. I don't know if you've ever thought about where these things come from. Do they just come from out of the earth? Does one day suddenly they just appear? And the answer is no. That's not how these things happen. What I want to do today is to tell you the story of where data warehouse came from, because that can help you understand how to build and use data warehouses in the future. Building and using data warehouses in the future, for those of you that want a good paying job, is a very good thing to do. To have the skills of data warehousing is something that corporations pay a lot of money for, and for good reason. Data warehousing helps corporations make important decisions. So I want to tell you a story today, and the story sounds kind of strange. When you first hear it, you sit there and say, what is he talking about? But I want today to talk to you today about something called spider web systems. And you say spider web systems. So when you think of a spider and you think of a web, you think of these lines that are connected, and that's what spiders do to catch their food. Now, we're not really going to be talking about spiders today, but you'll see where spider web systems comes into our presentation today. So let's go ahead and get started on our talk today about the origins of data warehousing and something called spider web systems. In order to do this, we need to go back to the very beginnings of the computer profession. We need to understand a little bit about the history of how all of this happened. Now, what I'm talking about, I look across the audience today, and I can tell you most of you probably weren't even born when these things were happening that I'm talking about. But once upon a time, in the early days of our profession, there were some things called magnetic tape. And we ran computers. This is kind of hard to imagine, but we ran computers with these electronic tape things that ran around on a little loop. I don't know if you know it. It's kind of interesting where that came from. Have you ever seen something called a player piano? That player pianos are these pianos that sit there and play themselves. If you've ever looked inside a player piano, what you find is a paper loop that controls what keys are played, and that's how they make music. Well, that's actually what they started with many years ago with computers. They started with how we controlled player pianos, and that's how they thought that we could and should control computers. Now, in today's world, you don't see a magnetic tape at all. In fact, the only place I believe you can see magnetic tape computers is in a museum. they don't use them in business, and again, I'd be very surprised if anybody here has ever seen one or used one. But that was how things began in the beginning. We had these things called magnetic tape. Now, the problem with magnetic tape, or there actually were lots of problems, but the problem with magnetic tape was that it couldn't hold much data, that you could only put a very limited amount of data on your magnetic tape. So very quickly, they came up with something called punched cards, called punched hollerith cards. And these punched hollerith cards were card decks. Now, in some places, you still today, in a few places, can see punched cards. You I doubt you have them in Mexico, but there may be a few of them left over, and again, most of them are found in museums. But the idea behind a punched card was you could have this little key punch machine, and you punch these holes in a card, and these holes in a card were read into the computer. And you could have much more capacity with punched cards than you ever had with magnetic with tape, with paper tape. And then one day they discovered that these things called punched cards had a lot of problems as well. First off, they were actually quite expensive, number one. The second thing about punched cards that was kind of a problem, and this happened to me, and it happened to everybody that used punch cards. You're walking down the hall with a deck of punched cards like this, and somehow you drop it. Well, when you drop the punched cards on the floor, you then have the problem of picking them up and then resequencing them. And resequencing them in the right order was something that was not a lot of fun. However, these punched cards were an improvement over the paper tapes that we had. And then along came something called magnetic tapes. And again, now you will see magnetic tapes today. They're still used today. There are these tape drives that sit there and spin around and spin around. And the thing about magnetic tape is inexpensive. You can hold lots and lots of data on it, and it was an improvement over punched cards. But even with magnetic tape, there was a lot of problems. The problems with magnetic tape the major problem with magnetic tape is that in order to read one record, you had to read the whole tape. And it's an expensive, time-consuming process to have to spin and read the whole tape to go find one record. And so this is what computing looked like in the early days. What am I talking about here? The 1960s, the late 1950s, and the 1960s. This is what computing looked like. And then the next thing you know was we began to build applications. We found that with paper tape and magnetic tape, we could build these things called applications. And so we started to build applications. Now, these applications that we built in the early days were actually quite powerful things, because you see what the computer was doing. The computer was replacing people doing work. If you didn't have a computer doing it, you had to have people doing it. And in terms of the cost and the accuracy and a lot of reasons, trying to do things manually was a difficult, awkward task, something you didn't want to do. So as awkward as we think that, as crude as we think that magnetic tape and cards were, they were still an improvement over whatever was the option in that day and age. So we started to build these things called applications, and we found that applications were good. And we found that we could build them, and we started to have lots and lots of applications back in the 1960s. But we soon discovered that these things called magnetic tapes started to get out of hand. There started to be lots and lots of these magnetic tapes. And there were so many that people's brains began to burst because of trying to keep track of these magnetic tapes. And so along that line, we found that the next improvement in technology was something called disk storage, magnetic disk storage. Now, that's what most of you have probably seen. And when people think about the computer today, what they think about is magnetic storage. That's what 99% of the world uses today in one form or the other, and that's what you're probably the most familiar with. But there was this preceding technology that existed before magnetic disk storage, and you need to know about that. So one day we began to have this thing called disk storage. Now, the thing about disk storage is that the improvement, the major improvement, is that in order to find one record, you didn't have to go look at the whole thing. That with tape storage, you had to do that. But with magnetic storage, you can go in and find a given record without having to search the whole file for your records. And this began to be a very good thing for people to do and for the world in general. Direct access storage device, DASD, DASD, as it's sometimes called, direct access storage device. And so these things were, thank you, sir. Thank you, Victor. I appreciate that. These things were very powerful, and the cost of storage started to drop. In the early days of magnetic storage, of disk storage, the cost was actually quite high, and the capacity was actually quite low. But over time, we began to be able to manufacturers to make disk storage very powerful and very inexpensive. And so because of the power and inexpensive forces at work, that's why disk storage came into play. Well, along about the time that disk storage came into play, there began to be something else that was out there. We discovered that we needed some technology called a database management system, DBMS. Now, what the database management system did for us was it allowed us to go in and manage the data on disk storage. And it provided a lot of services that the programmer would otherwise have to do. And so soon there was this thing called DBMS, Database Management Systems. And that too was a great improvement in terms of the evolution. I'm describing today for you an evolution that has occurred. And in terms of the history of how technology has come, this is something that you ought to know. Every student of computer science ought to know a little bit about the history of how all of this happened around the world. And so anyway, we had these things called database management systems. And it wasn't long after we had database management systems that we soon started to have something called on-the-line database management systems. Now, this is an interesting thing happened when we started to have online database management systems. Because we could go in and access the data directly, we could then start to entertain doing something called online transaction processing. Now, everybody in here, whether you know it or not, has been a user of online transaction processing systems. When you go to the bank, how do you think the bank teller knows how much money you have in the bank? When you go to an airline and you want to make a reservation for a trip to go somewhere, how do you think the airline knows how to build your system? This thing called transaction processing systems changed the way business was conducted. That suddenly, one day, we could do things with transaction processing systems that we couldn't do things before. And business, it was like milk to a baby. Suddenly, business couldn't live without this thing called transaction processing systems. And we have them today. Airlines have them, banks have them, manufacturers have them. They exist in lots and lots of places today. And how do they exist? At the heart of being able to do transaction processing systems is the whole notion that we can go get data directly. If we had to sit there and spin through a whole file to run a transaction, we never would have had transaction processing systems. So the next thing you know was we started to have these transaction processing systems, and they were very important to business itself. You know, for those of you that are students starting your career out there, you want to know how to make money, you want to know how to succeed, get yourself a skill that business really needs, and they will pay good money for what you do. That is, it's as simple as that. And learn something that somebody needs, and you're on your way to becoming an important, wealthy business person, which is a good thing to strive for. So anyway, we began to have these things called these applications, these transaction processing applications. And the next thing you know was these applications started to like sprout like the jacaranda in springtime. That suddenly they were everywhere, and I mean they were all over, and people thought that was a really good thing. Now, you would think that your end user would be happy with all of this, but end users are funny people. Let me tell you a little secret. End users are never happy. That whatever you give them, that they find something else to want. That's the nature of being an end user in the world, and that's another little secret that you need to learn. But anyway, so the end user began to have all of these applications put together. And the next thing you know, something happened. The end user said, oh, you know something? I've got this application over here. I need some data from this application off over here. And this person over here in this application, they need data from here. So when we built the application, we didn't know we were going to need this data, but now that we have the data, we know that we need it. So I needed to start to have information to be shared across applications. Now, you wouldn't think that that would present a problem, but it turns out it presents a really profound problem. But how did we solve that problem? You say, well, gee, Bill, I've got an application over here, and I've got another application off over here. Why don't I just write a little program to go find the data, take the data, and put it off over here in this application? Isn't that a simple answer? And the answer is, yeah, and that's exactly what we did. And it turned out that that's a very naive answer. It turned out that there were some things that happened when we did that were evil. Things that we had some consequences we didn't understand. And we'll get to that in just a second. So we see then that we have these applications. Now we need to start to share data across the applications. And we build these things called extract programs. And so we build these extract programs, and the next thing you know is these extract programs begin to appear everywhere. If you think the springtime has got a lot of jacarandas, the springtime has got even more weeds than nice flowers and trees coming out. And so this is what the world started to look like. We started to have, and this is actually an architecture. It's not a very good architecture, but it is an architecture. And so this is what happened in the world. And now, where did this happen, by the way? Did this happen in one corporation? It happened everywhere. And it didn't matter what kind of business you were in. You could be in manufacturing. You could be in consulting. You could be in retailing. It didn't matter what you were in. This is what everybody did. This is the way systems evolved and what the world looked like. And so we started to find out that, gee, Bill, these extract programs, our user said they wanted data to be moved from here to here. And we gave that to them. But you know what? Our end user still isn't happy. Our end user still has got problems with things. Again, you have to understand that end users are never happy people. That's it's true. I'm telling you the gospel truth. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Mexico, United States, Canada, England. Doesn't matter. It absolutely doesn't matter. End users are people who are never satisfied. And sure enough, this moving of data from one application to the next did not satisfy the end user. And the end user was unhappy for a lot of reasons. So the end user decided that the next thing they were going to do was to bring their personal computer into the organization. So instead of having all of these systems built by the IT organization, they brought in their personal computer. And there was some other technologies. There's some technology called 4GL technology that came along, and there were a wide variety of the technologies. But the next thing you know was the end user wanted to have control of their environment. They didn't like it that the IT department was controlling where everything was. And so, this is how it happens. Now, I don't know if you recognize this. What does this kind of look like? This kind of looks like a spider web. This is how kind of spiders build things. They put in one line here and one line here. The next thing you know is you've got this big spider web. So this is where spider web systems come from. And what's wrong with spider web systems? There's a lot of things wrong with spider web systems. But what's wrong with spider web systems? The main thing that's wrong with spider web systems is something called data integrity. And you say, data integrity? What do you mean by data integrity? Well, it turns out that data integrity is something that's very important, because you see what happened is the organization ends up not with data, but with lots of data. And they've got the same element. Let's take your bank balance. Now, your bank balance in this environment, in one place, you've got 4,000 pesos in your bank account. You've got 40,000 another place. You've got 20,000 another place. Wait a minute. That's not right. At any moment in time, there's one and only one value. And except that in a system like this, you've got multiple values. And try making decisions in an environment like this. It's not the matter that you don't have data. It's a matter that you have data that you can't believe. That's what we mean by data integrity. And so it's this whole notion that with this evolution of spiderweb systems, again, which everybody on this earth, I have to tell you, in today's world, there's a lot of organizations that have not overcome, but have learned to master this environment. On the other hand, there's a lot of organizations on this earth that are still living in this environment right here. And this is a miserable environment to live in. There's this. I used to live and work in this environment, and I'm going to tell you right now, it's no fun because you're in a position. Have you ever played a game where you can't win? You know, if you're going to play a game, at least you need to have a chance of winning, and that's part of why we play games. But if there's no chance of you winning, games cease to be a lot of fun when you can't win. And when you are trying to work and live and become a professional in this environment here, guess what? You can't win. And it's not pleasant. It's not a good situation to be in. Now let me point out something else that's kind of unique about this spiderweb environment that we have here. How did organizations go about trying to solve this problem? What did vendors tell them to do? Vendors said, you need to buy more software. You need to buy more hardware. You need to bring in more people. Now, do you know what this is like by trying to increase this environment? Do you know what this is like? This is like going to a fire. You've got a building that's on fire, and you want to put the fire out, and you've got a pail of liquid, and you throw the liquid on, except instead of throwing water on the fire to put it out, you just threw gasoline on the fire, and it gets even bigger and worse. That's what happens when you try to put resources, computers, software, and people added to this environment, make things worse, not better. And that presents some real problems. Anyway, so this is what we mean by spiderweb systems. These are some of the problems associated with spiderweb systems. I've got one slide coming up right here. This, folks, is a spiderweb system. This is taken from an organization called AT&T. They're a telephone company in the United States. And see those little black dots there? Do you know what those little black dots are? I want to point them out. See this black dot here? And this black, you know what these are? These are applications. And do you know how many people may be supporting that application? In some case, 300 and 400 people are behind each one of these black boxes. This represents the work of about 10,000 people trying to work together. Now, how would you like to try to make an intelligent decision based on this data? Because you see, because you've got a piece of data, you've got data flying everywhere. You have no idea what right, correct data is. And so in terms of trying to make a decision, I'm not going to use the word impossible lightly, but it is impossible to make a decision based on this architecture. can't be done. I don't care who you are and how smart you are, can't be done. And furthermore, adding more hardware, more software, and more consultants makes matters worse, not better. So this is what a spider web system is. What we need here is not more technology. We need a change in architecture. We need to rethink how we construct this environment and how we make decisions. And this is where data warehouse came from. Data warehouse came from this architecture, the spider web systems architecture, and data warehouse is the architectural solution that we have for taking this environment and turning it into a rational environment, into where I mentioned winning at a game. Nobody likes to play a game they can't win. Well, by starting to change the architecture, you now have a game that you can win. That's what it is. So this is where data warehouse came from. This is why we build data warehouses. This is why organizations need to go to data warehouse. Now, who doesn't like this notion of a data warehouse? You might be surprised. The people that don't like data warehouse were the vendors, the hardware and software vendors, to say, wait a minute, you're coming in here and selling this thing called data warehouse. I want to go continue to sell them more and more hardware and more software. So vendors didn't like this architecture at all. So this then, when you start to study and learn about data warehouse, and I advise you to do that because corporations will pay you a lot of good money to understand architecturally what you're doing, that you need to understand how all of this came about. Okay, that's the little presentation I wanted to do for you today. I'd be more than happy to answer questions or talk about. There's a lot of other subjects that are out there. I'll be more than happy to answer questions. Thank you.